What? I got something on me? Hello tarantula lovers, I'm Alex and you're watching Tarantula Haven. Today I'd like to talk about feeders. You have tarantulas, you have to feed them, and tarantulas aren't really picky about what they eat. If they can overpower it, they'll eat it usually. So there's a variety of sources of feeder prey that you can give to your tarantula. One of the most common ones, of course, is crickets. Now, personally, when I first started keeping tarantulas, I was feeding them crickets. And there's good and bad with feeding crickets. If you only have a few tarantulas, just a small handful, maybe just one, then crickets are fine. And they're relatively easy to find if you live somewhere where you have a bait and tackle store nearby. Bait and tackle store is a good place to find them, probably the cheapest. If you have a pet shop nearby that sells them, usually you're going to pay a lot more for them. You usually run about 10 cents a piece, and it doesn't seem to matter what size they are. But you know, you're going to pay for them, but you don't need that many, so it's still relatively cheap to buy them at a pet shop. And if you order them, then of course you're going to start ordering in bulk. And therein kind of lies a problem with me when I was feeding crickets. Now, I was raising bearded dragons and crested geckos and things like that. So there came a point where I was ordering some crickets online. And the problem came when I had to house these crickets. Crickets are very stinky. They smell very bad. Their waste has a very strong odor to it. And when you house them, it doesn't matter where you house them, it seems like they're going to foul that up really, really fast. So crickets really became something that I did not want to deal with after a while. Not to mention they're also very cannibalistic. So you have to keep them well fed. If you don't keep them well fed, then they start feeding on one another. So it does tend to become a problem. So crickets, I'm not really a fan of crickets. Another alternative, of course, are mealworms and superworms and things like that. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But one of the best things that I found, especially if you have a lot of stuff to feed. My wife still keeps bearded dragons. I still keep crested geckos. And of course, I have a whole bunch of tarantulas that I feed now. So the best alternative that I could find was roaches. And, you know, it was a thing that I didn't really get into until later on. And I started looking into it and come to find out that roaches don't really have that terrible an odor. They do have a little bit of an odor, but if you keep them clean, if you keep their enclosure nice and neat, and you take care of them, they tend to not produce a very strong odor, which is a very big plus for me. And another thing about certain roaches is they tend to not be cannibalistic, so you don't have to worry about them eating one another. Most people prefer Dubia roaches. If they're legal in your state, then Dubia roaches are pretty much the way to go. As far as the amount of chitin that they have, chitin tends to be the exoskeleton, the hard shell that they have on their outside. Some prey items produce more chitin or have more chitin than others. If you're talking about reptiles, you want to watch that amount of chitin. So dubias tend to have a lower amount of chitin. They're kind of soft-bodied, so they're really, really good for reptiles. But as far as tarantulas are concerned, they don't usually eat that outer shell, the exoskeleton. They suck up the juices from the inside, and they leave behind that little husk in the form of a little ball that we refer to as a bolus. And so that's not really an issue when it comes to tarantulas. Here in Florida, dubias are illegal. I think Tennessee as well. So, you know, you have to check with your state to see if they're legal or not. If you go to online to order some, you can usually find out that they won't ship to your state, and that's when you know, yeah, they're not legal in that state. but there are a few Florida roaches that are legal. One of the roaches that I use are Discoid roaches. Discoid roaches are very similar to Dubia roaches, and as far as size is concerned, in my opinion, they're a little bit larger. One of the things about them is they tend to have more chitin to them, and that's of course something that you want to watch out for with reptiles, but it's not that big of a difference with Dubia roaches as opposed to Discoid roaches. Discoid roaches are legal in Florida because I believe they are established in Florida as an invasive species, but I believe Dubias are not, so they're trying to keep that from happening. As far as getting into roaches as feeders and breeding your own, there is a bit of a setup and there is a bit of a cost up front. They are more expensive than, say, crickets. So when I first got into them, I bought, it was probably, it was at a reptile show, and they had like a little 32-ounce deli tub full of them, and I think it was 20 of them in that tub, and I think it was like $20 for the little 32-ounce tub. So you know, that's $1 a roach, and that's a little bit steep, but you know, those first 20 roaches that I had is what I started with. I went back to another reptile show and I ended up finding them again, and this time I bought 100 of the Nymphs. These are smaller ones, and those Nymphs were probably, I think, around the same price for 100 of them, maybe a little bit more. I can't remember right now, but that's all I started out with, and before I knew it, you know, I have more than enough that I can feed everything that I have. But you have to be really patient. So when you first get them, you have to set them up and you have to keep them in a tub. And I'll kind of show you, I worked a little video out, or I did a little video to show you how I set them up initially, and then from there you just go bigger as your amount of roaches that you have gets higher. So watch this video and it'll show you how to set up a tub for roaches, and then I'll get into a little bit more about the roaches themselves. So here's my finished product. As you saw in the video, I was having a little bit of trouble with the drill bit that I use for cutting out holes. So I switched to the hole cutter, the saw hole cutter drill bit on that, and it made a cleaner cut. And I have done tubs like this before, but I've done larger tubs, and the lids on those had softer lids. It was a softer plastic, so it cut through just fine. But I was having an issue with this one because this is a little bit of a harder lid, and every time it went to bite into the plastic, it just snagged and threw the drill bit out of there. So that's why I ended up switching to the hole cutter. So I guess you got to kind of be careful as to what the lid is like. This is my first time using one of these little hefty tubs. And one thing that you have to make sure of is that you choose one that has smooth sides, where the plastic is smooth on the inside as well as the outside. I mean, the outside's not so important, but on the inside you want to make sure that you have that smooth plastic. And the reason for that, Dubias, Discoids, They can't climb smooth surfaces. If you have one that has a rougher surface to it, it's still okay. It's just that the nymphs, the tiny ones, they are able to climb that because they can get a foothold on those rough edges and climb up them. So if you don't have the lid secured, then you may have an issue with some escapes as far as the nymphs are concerned. The adults you really don't have to worry about. They're so heavy bodied that they can't climb up and get a good foothold on it. So one thing that you want to do about your enclosures is that you want to make sure that you have adequate ventilation. Ventilation is important. So that's why I have all these holes, and the holes are larger. It's better to have more holes and have too much ventilation than to not have enough, especially when you're putting on the screen mesh in there, because once you put that on, it's going to be real difficult to go back in there and make any new holes and have to put down new screen and everything. So if you have more than enough ventilation, you can always cover up ventilation. But if you don't have enough, then you're going to have to make some changes, and of course it's going to require you to tear some stuff up before you can correct it and make sure it's right. So let's talk about the roaches themselves. Now, dubia is the preferred prey item that a lot of people raise, and part of the reason why dubias are so popular is because they're sexually dimorphic as adults. Even the nymphs, you can tell them apart, but adults, you can easily tell them apart. Males have wings, females do not, so you can easily at a glance tell which ones are your males and which ones are your females. And that's a good thing because you always want to cull out your males. Too many males tend to stress out the females, so you want to cut back on those. So those are the things that people tend to feed off right away, and you want to keep that ratio low in comparison to the amount of females that you have. Same thing goes for discoids, but discoids are a little bit different. Discoids is a little bit harder to tell the difference between a male and a female. Now, to the trained eye, it's not so bad, but if you're beginning, if this is a new thing for you, you might have some difficulty determining the difference between males and females. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that so you can see that. All right, so in your discoids, they're a fairly large roach. Okay, and this one that I'm holding is a female. And the way I know that is because, my wife's going to kill me for that, is because if you look at the wings, hold on, if you look at the wings, you see how the lower part of the abdomen is sticking out beyond the wings? Then that lets me know that that is a female. When it is relaxed, the lower part of that abdomen will always jut out, and you can see that is a female. Not to mention that they're also a little bit heavy bodied. If you look at them, their abdomen will be a lot fatter than, say, a male. So it's real easy to tell where your females are. All right, so let me show you a male. As a comparison. All right, so here's a male, and if you can see that, notice how the wings go all the way below the abdomen. So you really don't see that abdomen on it. The wings are covering it completely. Also, if you look at it from the side, or if you look at it from underneath, notice how the abdomen is relatively narrow. It's pretty thin. So it's not carrying a bunch of eggs and things like that, so of course it's going to be a little bit more slender bodied than, say, the female. So they look the same, but of course you can tell when the wings cover the abdomen, that is a male. As far as the nymphs are concerned, come on, get down. These are the little guys that I end up feeding to, say, my slings. They're small, they're spotted. They almost don't even look like roaches. They've got almost a beetle-like appearance to me. So, if you're squeamish about roaches, then of course you probably don't want to be feeding roaches, but more than likely if you're into tarantulas, you're probably not that squeamish, especially about roaches. You're probably into handling crickets and mealworms and things like that. Roaches is no different. As far as discoids are concerned, they don't really creep me out. The winged ones, a lot of people tend to get a little bit freaked out by them because they look like these big old roaches that we have around here that fly around and so on. But those do give me the heebie-jeebies for whatever reason, but these guys don't. They're food. And one thing that you have to do is you kind of have to look at them almost like pets, especially when you get them to start out your colony, because you're going to have to take care of them like a pet, and that's what I want to get into next. The first thing you want to do when you set up your roach colony is you want to have something for them to climb on, something for them to hide in. And one of the best things that works for that purpose is these egg carton, these flats. And you can buy these, you can order them online. You can find them at different places. I get mine at Tractor Supply Company. They had an overage of these, so I got a pack of, I think 12 for 99 cents a piece. So I bought a whole bunch of them to kind of stock up. But these do make great material for them because it gives them lots of little hiding places to hide. If you can find other material that is cardboard similar to this, then that'll work just fine. But this is what I find works the best. So anyway, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have it the right size for your tub. In this case, it goes, pretty high up the tub, but not all the way to the top. You don't want to have it go all the way to the top to where they could reach the lid. Obviously, you don't want to have any escapes. You don't want them hanging out on the bottom of the lid, just in case you open it up and some of them fall out and run off. So that's just to prevent them from escaping. But, just enough to get to, pretty high, but not all the way up. And you want to put them in vertically. And the reason for that is because that allows the droppings, their droppings, what they call frass, to go down to the bottom. And it doesn't stay in the egg cartons themselves if you lay them flat like this. That allows waste to build up in there, and it also will trap moisture, and eventually they're going to chew holes through it and everything. So if you have it upright, it's going to be a thing where everything kind of stays nice and clean and gives them a clean area, a clean surface for them to climb on and stay on. When they have their babies, they do produce live young, so they'll actually go into some of these little holes right here where the eggs go, and they'll have their young there, and you might open it up and look inside and see a whole bunch of little white babies all around the mom, and that just means that she's given birth to all those babies. So it's a perfect breeding ground for them. So anyway, you want to put them in, and you want to put them in upright. So just kind of lean them against the wall like that. And just kind of stagger them. Just like that, so that they have plenty of spaces for them to get into and crawl into and hide. And you kind of want to leave yourself a little bit of space on the side, like here, so that you can put food and other things there for them to feed on. As far as feeding your roaches, one of the things that I feed them is wheat bran. And I buy the wheat bran by the sack, also at Tractor Supply, and I think it's like $12 for this big old sack. I don't know how much it weighs, but it's pretty inexpensive, and it's the same kind of stuff that your mealworms come in, and superworms and things like that. So that's what I feed them, but I also mix in some fish flake food for protein. They love the fish flake food, and I just kind of mix it up in these little jars like this and just shake it around to kind of give it a nice even mixture. They love that fish flake food. They go in there and they eat that stuff up first before they eat any of the wheat bran. Now, you also have to give them a source of moisture. Vegetables, fruit, oranges are really good. A lot of people use oranges. I don't recommend it all the time. Kind of vary it a little bit, but oranges are a good source of moisture because they're encapsulated, and each little capsule, of course, has juice in it, so they'll go in there and they'll eat that up, and it'll last them maybe 2 or 3 days. But you want to make sure that you clean that stuff out as soon as they eat it, and whatever's left behind, you clean it up. You don't want to allow that food to rot in there. If you start letting food rot inside your roach bins, then you're going to start running into some problems. First of all, you're going to attract fruit flies, and you're also going to attract other types of flies that are going to be pests to your roaches, not to mention they can also be pests to your tarantulas. So you want to make sure that you keep the food items clean. And fresh. So if you find that you check it after 2 or 3 days and it's still there and it's starting to go bad, pull it out, put in a fresh piece so that it doesn't continue to rot, and you don't end up developing these other issues. And periodically, I would say maybe once a month, maybe once every 2 months, kind of do a cleaning of the roach tub itself. I usually keep a couple of these roach tubs identical so that when one of them gets dirty, I just transfer them to a clean one, and that gives me the opportunity to go in there and clean out the old one and make sure that that is nice and fresh and clean so that I can put the roaches back in when the other one gets dirty and just transfer them back and forth. This is just a beginner tub. This is what I would recommend to begin. They like heat. They don't like it to get too cold. They won't reproduce if it gets too cold. So you want to make sure that you keep your temperatures about 85 to 90 degrees. And that doesn't mean that the whole tub has to be 85 to 90 degrees. What I usually do is I get one of those reptile heating pads and I place the tub on top of it, and it doesn't heat up the entire enclosure, but it heats up one area. And you'll find that when you open the tub, those roaches will be congregated in that nice warm area, and that's kind of where they stay. And they'll breed if they have those temperatures and they can regulate themselves. But if you have them too cold, then you won't get very much breeding occurring. So, all your investment will be for nothing because they'll just end up dying out. They are a long-lived roach. They live to be about 18 months. So, that's pretty good for an insect. They live for a little while. So a year and a half of keeping a roach, and it will produce for you, and it will keep making food for you. So I think that's a pretty good deal. So getting your roaches into their new tub is pretty easy. Of course, you'll usually probably get them in those little 32-ounce tubs, those deli tubs, but I've got them in this jar just because what I'm doing is simply transferring some adults into this tub to start a new colony. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's real simple. Of course, you're just going to end up taking them from one and putting them into another. And just like that, they're in their new home. And they're kind of find their way around and hide in the egg carton. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that you want to use a dark tub like this, which is why I chose this one. I have others that are also dark like this, and you want to kind of avoid your clear tubs. I know it's nice to be able to look from the outside and see in, but roaches don't like light. Just like regular roaches, these guys don't like to be in the light as well. So if they have a dark tub like this, it's really easy to block out the light, and you can keep them in a well-lit area and not have to worry about stressing them out because they're in too much light. So you want to make sure that they're as comfortable as possible so that they'll reproduce for you. So that's the reason why I chose a dark tub as opposed to a clear tub. And you can use a clear tub. I've seen people raise them in aquariums, and that's fine, but you want to make sure that you put them in a dark area. Another thing too is that I put a lid on them. There are people that will breed them with the lids off and leave them with the lids off. I don't like doing that because that allows other things to get in there. You can have other roaches come in there to try to eat on their food. And not only that, but it also allows easy access by other prey and things like that to get in there. Spiders and other things that, might roam around your house, especially if you keep them in, say, your garage, or if you're keeping them somewhere where those kinds of things might be. So that's the reason why I would recommend keeping a lid on them as opposed to leaving them wide open. So as I mentioned earlier, the reason that I was setting up that smaller tub is because I'm trying to start a new colony. I have a larger colony. I actually have 2 larger colonies. And all that came from those 20 adults that I bought and the 100 nymphs. After that, they just kind of kept breeding like crazy. It was a thing where when I first got them, I worried over them. I treated them just like pets. I checked on them all the time just to see how they were doing, making sure that they weren't dying off, that anything was going wrong. And they were doing fine, and they, it amazed me that there were really no die-offs. I would check and they would all be alive, and I would feed them, and periodically I would see little babies. So I was getting excited, things are changing and there's more roaches in there, and I would see more and more, and eventually they would get, bigger, and I would have larger nymphs, and then pretty soon those things started turning into adults, and then next thing I know, I had more roaches than I knew what to do with. So that's a good problem if you're breeding so that you can feed a menagerie of animals just like I have. And, so eventually you'll end up switching to a tub like this. And this is where I have most of my roaches. And let me just give you an idea. Now, this is a problem you may run into, and having more roaches than you know what to do with. So that's just to give you an idea as to how just a few roaches can turn into a whole tub of roaches. And I now don't have a problem feeding all my different pets. My wife's bearded dragons, my crested geckos, my tarantulas, and so on. So, I just feed them, I take care of them, make sure I keep them clean, and they kind of maintain themselves, and they pay you back by producing more food for you. So it's a pretty cool thing. If you end up with this kind of problem where you have more roaches than you know what to do with, more than likely because you're involved in tarantulas, and if you start getting into lots of tarantulas, you probably have lots of different contacts, and you probably are like me on Facebook and different types of groups and so on, and people need feeders all the time. You might even want to start selling some off and kind of help you offset the cost of feeding them. Sell them cheaper than what people can get online and things like that. So it kind of helps you out a little bit too. So they can pay you back if you decide that you want to sell some and you start getting a lot of them just like that. Another reason why I set up a second tub or another beginner tub is because I started running out of the medium-sized nymphs. I had some smaller nymphs. I had really, really small nymphs, and I had adults, and I had large nymphs, but I didn't have those in-between sizes because I'm currently feeding a bunch of juvenile bearded dragons, and they eat a lot, and they've been eating up all my medium-sized nymphs. So every now and then you might need to switch to an alternative. There are different, options. You can go with crickets, like I said before. Mealworms, although for tarantulas, I don't really recommend mealworms. And that's merely just a personal thing. Mealworms have a tendency to burrow down into the substrate, and if you can't find it or if you forget it, they can hurt your tarantula. They can go in there and they can eat it, especially if it's vulnerable, and you might find that your tarantula will be missing limbs, or it might be gone altogether. That has happened before. So I tend to avoid that. Another thing that you could use is superworms. They're a little bit larger, of course, than mealworms. And it's kind of why I wore my shirt today. this Super Mario shirt. I recently watched a video from Tom Moran of Tom's Big Spiders, and it just cracked me up because he referred to them as Super Mario worms, and then he was calling them Mario worms. So, if you're watching, Tom, this is for you, for your Mario worms. It's a me, Mario! Superworms are a good alternative for those medium-sized nymphs, just like the ones I'm missing. So that's why I've kind of switched to that. I have bred superworms before, what they call zoophobas. They're not that easy to breed because you have to separate them out into individual containers and allow them to turn into beetles. If they're kept together, they won't turn into beetles. They'll actually start eating each other after a while. So, you know, they're not exactly the best things to breed. But if you want to, it's not that difficult. But, you know, it just requires a little bit of effort on your part. So I've kind of switched to those temporarily until I can get my stock up for the medium-sized nymphs of the roaches, which is why I'm creating that new tub there that I've started. So, you know, every now and then it's good to switch out here and there. So I haven't actually tried them with my tarantulas yet. They've been eating roaches just fine lately, but like I said, I've kind of run low on those medium-sized nymphs, so I'm going to do some superworms here and there to keep them fed, and I've also been feeding those to the bearded dragons as well. So let's finish this off by feeding some tarantulas, shall we? This is a Tarantulas sazimi. Is he not hungry? Let's try it again. Guess he's not hungry. We'll try him a little bit later. Chromatopelma cyanopubescens, otherwise known as the green bottle blue. Always quick to eat. Brachypelma albopilosum. Another Brachypelma albopilosum. Grammostola pulchra. Alright, very shy Grammostola pulchripes. Not a very spectacular takedown, but she took it. So that's my video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give me a like. If you want to see more, please subscribe. Until next time, keep loving them tarantulas.